I don't have many of my relatives here in Colorado. I've got two cousins and their families. One is in Colorado Springs and the other lives in Denver. And we've kind of connected. We've built up a nice convention, traditional family get-together. Every President's Day, we go up in the mountains, a place called Snow Mountain Ranch. We get together, our kids snowshoe, we ski, we inner tube. But the best part is getting together in the evening and we have conversations. We talk about the challenges we face with kids, with the work and life in general. We connect. Except this year. Two cousins had a falling out over political differences. And that hit home hard. Is anybody else, or is it just me that feels like we've got some division going on here? Yeah. Anybody else besides me want to do something about it?
Yes.
I thought long and hard about what to do. And in typical Toastmaster style, I spoke. I came up with speeches about critical thinking, about overcoming cultural differences. Heck, I even talked about toilets around the world. And then an idea started germinating in my mind. What if instead of talking, I worked on listening? What is that if I started thinking about what I wanted to ask, what kind of questions instead of what I wanted to say? That felt like a good idea. Except those that know me know that questions are not my strong point. I was having a conversation with my brother, who's a little bit politically different-minded than I am, and the questions came out a little bit like, are you sure you believe that? Can't you just see that I'm right? And I realized these aren't questions. These are statements pretending to be questions. I had to do something about that. So I started thinking about, well, okay, listen right here. And I came across the basic listening 101, basic listening. And I found them to be kind of petty platitudes, the things like, oh, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Yeah, right. Or you can't engage your ears when your mouth is moving. Yeah, that's listening, but I need more than that. Then I found active listening. Things like engaging with somebody, having contact, and really talking to them versus, oh, I get it, I'm doing it, being distracted. Or maybe, really listen to what they want to say and encourage them, as opposed to thinking about what you want to say. Or instead of, or working with them and trying to understand. Tell me more, Rachel. I'd like to know more, please. As opposed to dismissing. And that was good. I felt like I had a connection. Did any of you feel a difference between the pros and cons there? So that was a good start, but I felt there was something more. And then I came across what I'll call immersive listening. And this is getting beyond just hearing the person. This is paying attention to the nonverbals, the actual gestures and the facial expressions, and even paying attention to what's not being said. And here you start getting another level. This is where, try to imagine the following. If you're in a conversation with somebody and they don't just understand you, they get you. How does that feel? How would that feel if you're in a conversation like that? That is empathy. Or take another level. What if you were in a conversation with somebody else and you were the one being able to mirror their feelings? What if you were able to go even further and let go of your positions of what you thought and maybe acknowledge or even accept a change in heart, listening to what they're saying? That's vulnerability. From basic listening 101 to active listening to immersive listening. With this, you can help change the way you interact with people. Go from the periods and the dots of this is what I think, or the statements that people toss around and throw at each other like darts, the exclamation points that become spears. Move to question marks that are olive branches of understanding. Or go further. Against the dot, dot, dot of connection, understanding, empathy, and vulnerability. Change your punctuation and build those connections. Thank you.
Session. Help me welcome Alexander. Woohoo!
Thank you, Terry.
Terry, thank you for doing so much double, triple duty today at our meeting. We are a small but powerful group, and you exemplify that today by not only being the Toastmaster, but also being the speaker. I really appreciated the speech that you gave today. It helped to frame and to expand on what Joe talked about earlier. You gave us some real good, strong ideas on how we could actually use listening to our benefit, not just simply hearing, but being able to actually realize positive outcomes through our use of listening. I like the way that you structured this, the way that you had the dichotomy between focus and active, and when one was going to be much more appropriate than the other. Also, realizing that you could use this through a very extended story, I can see how that would be extremely powerful within the context of doing a much larger workshop. That story, I think, was well suited for that. For this audience, you might have needed to trim that just a little, but it worked well, and I think that everybody found something to take out of that message. One of the things that I felt was challenging was this lectern. For your staging of this speech, you spent almost all of your time right over here in this space. I can appreciate that the grocery store was back over here. That was very good. Maybe you could have used more of that, telling that part of the story over here. Whereas over here you were trimming the bush, and the lectern worked effectively there, but it seemed like you were kind of trapped over in this part of the space. So that's one of the things that I would encourage you to perhaps move the lectern away in that particular case. I want to ask other folks for their feedback on Terry's speech today.
Connie, I thought you had wonderful presence, and I could appreciate all of your emotions of all of the things that you were going through in your face. Like your face engaged really well and drew me into the story and what you were trying to express. I thought you did a really nice job.
Thank you, Connie. John?
I'd like to talk a little bit about the handouts, because they got back to me and you were already into your speech. And I think if you're going to do handouts, you either have to hand them out, make sure that everybody has what they need before you start your speech, or you save them and hand them out at the end after you're done with your speech. Because they got back here to me, and I don't know, you have this handout on effective listening here, and I think James ended up with 2 or 3 pages of emojis or something that was stuck in with that, and so I wasn't quite for sure what went with where. And so that's one critical thing, I think, that you need to make sure that you have them take the time to hand them out, make sure everybody's got them if you're going to do it before your speech.
I'll build on that a little bit and a couple of other suggestions. If you are making a reference to something in the handout, be very specific and take time to let your audience look at it and comprehend initially what it is.
Mhm.
I know in this case, you got 5 to 7 minutes, you're just trying to get through the content to see if it's really going. What I would recommend is use your story right up front.
Mm.
Just part of it, enough to introduce that you're talking about a conflict of communication.
Mhm.
That then you can come back and do the callback to, here's how you could handle that situation. In my case, I was able to gain her trust and come back through that. I think that would help you introduce things quicker right up front. I think you are on track to make this really a fun workshop. It's challenging getting to this point as well because you're trying to get all of the content together. So congratulations, keep going.
Rachel?
So building on the handout, I can never see a handout during any workshop. I mean, 5 minutes or 4 hours, right? So I would have liked that there's 3 steps to focus listening and there's 7 to active listening. So I would name them out because you said it's complex, maybe 3-4 times, and that would have given you enough time to at least name the steps. You don't have to explain them, but at least you're giving like an outline of, hey, here's how, and this is totally selfish in my case. That's how I can follow you, right? But if I can, that helps everybody else.
But that's a key though, right? To know your audience.
Right.
And I think you just pointed out something that probably none of us in the room except you would have picked up on. Because we have the visual and you don't.
Correct. But I mean, usually you're always gonna have some listening, learning style on your room. No matter what room you're in, you're always going to have a mix between visual learners, kinesthetics learners, and auditory learners. So any auditory learner would learn better with you, with my needs. Does that make any sense? So it's not just for blind people, but people that are auditory and also dyslexic people who usually do not disclose. It's 1 on every 10, I think. So the likeness that somebody on your workshop has something like that, it's high. So I would have just mentioned it, not like, don't say it's in your handout. I mean, you could point it out, but you say if you want details, it's on your handout. But don't just rush through it.
So when I'm thinking about it, and I like your feedback, is at first I'll say complex because I don't want them to get bogged
correct.
down to 7.
Right.
And then when I go to, after I do focus, I'm going to list the 7, but then I'm going to be spending like 5 minutes on every step.
Right.
But I'll do that story straight away, and they'll have to remember that story straight away for like 35 minutes. You guys think that'll work?
You probably need more. You probably need a story for each one of them that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
Great.
then
Thank you.
Go back to the rule of make a point, tell a story, or
make a
tell a
point,
story to
make
make a point.
Yeah.
So list all 7 and make a story for each one, motivate them.
Yeah, the workshop I would have 1 for each story. The speech, not necessarily, like, on the 5 to 7, no, but on
Right.
the workshop for sure.
Right.
And then I would also, coming to story, you're a great storyteller. So like with the bees and stuff, like I would have put a little more life into it. Like I've seen you, so I know you can do it, And then the other thing is like even in the grocery store, make it into a dialogue. If something's a real dialogue, like you were more narrating, like I would make less narration, more dialogue on a story. That always makes it more memorable. So if you want people to remember, like if you actually set it up the story, they will remember. So like, change the voice, like the stock boy on your grocery store, right? So it's like, no ma'am, we're out of them, And then you go and you say, well, and then I thought about this and that, and then you narrate. So
Thank
then,
you,
right?
thank you.
Sorry.
Joe, you wanted to say something real quick.
So just, building on the stories, the first one I thought was interesting but didn't quite fit to me. It didn't kind of clarify how the focus is listening Gotcha. Insisting on making sure that your objective got met is one thing, but I didn't catch that as listening. Maybe more something in business related, because you said that was more applicable there.
Mhm.
The second story I found much more powerful, but there's one point that I thought was missing, was saying something like, before, applying active listening, I would have I would have had this, and we would have been in conflict, and we'd still be at each other's throats. Instead, I stopped, wanting to defend my point of view, but I wanted to let her hear, let her get her, vent and stuff, get to what's going on, and that went a lot further than you expected, and by doing so, you're now friends. Something like that, I think, would shortening the story itself, but getting more to the conflict and that resolution would be helpful.
Okay, Fred, I think you've got a lot of feedback here to
Yes.
incorporate into your speech. Good luck with that, and I'll turn it back over to you.